Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? It looks like, for North America at least, the PlayStation Vita has finally run its course. But what happened to it anyway, and what does the future hold for fans of the console? So, rumors and news of the Vita's demise is nothing new. They've actually been going on for a few years now. I even did a topic about it a little over a year ago where some Sony executives' remarks were kind of taken out of context, and the gaming news industry kind of blew up with this story about, oh, the PlayStation Vita is dead. That wasn't true at the time. They still supported the console. They were still being sold. In fact, they came out with new revisions of the console after those remarks even came out. And Sony even issued a press release saying, no, we still support the Vita. You just took the words out of context. And things kind of moved on from there. Life went on. Fans of the console were relieved and took solace in the fact that Sony was still there for them. New games were continuing to come out. But things are different now. It's late 2016, and it looks like the Vita has kind of gone quietly into the night, at least in North America and I would say most of Europe. I started noticing this a few months ago where big box stores like Target and Best Buy, the supplies of Vita consoles and games and accessories was starting to dwindle. I noticed that a lot of the games disappeared first, which I thought was kind of weird that the games would would leave inventory first. And then eventually the consoles stopped appearing on shelves, and then the accessories were put on clearance. And at the time I figured, okay, obviously the Vita wasn't a big seller, and maybe they were just trying to clear space on their shelves for something that would sell better. I don't really blame retailers for wanting to do that. They need to sell what people want to buy. But I guess I didn't really realize that that was actually marking the end of that console in North America. Sony's painting kind of a weird picture for the Vita. I checked a few different regional sites for PlayStation. I checked the US PlayStation site, the UK PlayStation site, and then the Japanese PlayStation site. And they actually look familiar to each other. They've got kind of the same visual style and layout, but they show different information. The US site doesn't list the PS3 or the Vita as being current hardware you can buy. Obviously, they're pushing the PS4 and PlayStation VR. But if you go under the games section, they still list categories for PS3 and Vita games. If you go to the UK site, it's a different story. They don't even make mention of the Vita at all. But the Japanese site is really different in that not only do they still list games for the Vita, but they even still have the product page for that console up. And that echoes a lot of the sentiment that Sony said about a year ago when it came to the roadmap and sales performance of PlayStation products. They said, obviously, PS4 sales were continuing to grow, and in fact, PS4 sales have been spectacular by comparison to other consoles. And obviously, PS3 sales were on the decline, that being an older console, and Vita sales were on the decline, at least outside Asia. Sony did specifically mention that Vita sales in Japan were continuing to be pretty steady and fairly strong. That country has kind of a love affair with handheld consoles, and I think it's really more due to social factors than anything else. It seems like people spend a lot of time commuting there, so they want something to do while they're on the train or the bus. But also, there's more acceptance of handheld gaming, it seems. Console gaming isn't as big of a thing, it seems, with the Japanese public as handheld gaming is. So the Vita continues to be strong in Japan, but it never really took off all that well in the US. I don't quite understand why the US isn't more into handheld gaming. Maybe it has something to do with the Game Boy and kind of the precedent that it set when it first launched in this country, in that it was largely kids who played it. And maybe we never really shook that. I mean, plenty of adults buy and play 3DS consoles and even the PlayStation Portable and the Vita, but it never seemed to be as big of an uptake from adults as console gaming was. I'm not quite sure why that is. I'm not quite sure why handheld gaming amongst adults isn't stronger in this country, but for one reason or another, it's not. And I think the Vita is perhaps a victim of that, but I think the real reason why the Vita specifically never took off was actually due to a bit of paranoia on Sony's part. The PlayStation Portable was Sony's first effort into handheld gaming. It actually came out after the PlayStation 1 with the flip-up LCD screen. I did a video about that as well. Sony did that kind of attached LCD screen for the PlayStation 1 console as a test to see how quote-unquote portable gaming would work with different markets. They ultimately decided to release the PlayStation Portable. Now, the PlayStation Portable, if you don't know, used little optical discs called UMDs for games and then also for video. You could buy movies and TV shows on them to watch on the console as well. But it also supported Wi-Fi and internet downloads of games, and those were stored to Sony's proprietary memory stick format. Now, memory stick wasn't exclusive to the PlayStation Portable. Sony used that format in a lot of its other products like cameras and camcorders. So the media, while it wasn't this universal format, it was common. Like, you could go to most stores and find those cards. So Sony standardized on its memory stick format for storing data on the PlayStation Portable. But what it found is that relatively early into the PlayStation Portable's life, people hacked it. They figured out how to write their own software for that console, gain access to the different hardware functions in it, and next thing you know, there was a pretty big piracy problem with PSP games, where people were able to figure out how to dump the contents of the UMDs to files stored on those memory sticks. And because the memory stick media was relatively inexpensive and swappable in the console, you can buy multiple memory sticks, people simply started trading those game files on the internet, and all you had to do was install custom firmware on your PSP, copy the files to a memory stick, and off you go. And Sony tried, but ultimately failed to really combat piracy on the PSP. And it's kind of notorious on that console that there's a lot of PSP games available for download on the internet illegally. And the firmware scene is, even to this day, still fairly strong. Sony got really burned by that, and I suspect when they were designing the Vita, they wanted some way to combat that. But I also suspect they knew that ultimately the Vita would end up with the same fate as the PSP. All the engineering in the world can't really get around people who have the time, effort, and inclination to defeat some sort of security mechanism. Ultimately, they knew that people would be able to hack the Vita. No matter how much they tried, people would find a vulnerability in the software and basically break that console wide open. And that has happened with the Vita. It is possible to get pirated games on the PlayStation Vita. So Sony decided to kind of work around the issue, or at least, I think, expect it to happen and kind of reluctantly acknowledge that ultimately that would happen. And they worked around that by simply, essentially taxing the hell out of the memory cards. For the Vita, they didn't use memory stick. One would have expected Sony to use memory stick because it already had that technology and the cards were on the market. But Sony used a proprietary memory card on the Vita, and they priced them very expensively. I think that's not for technological reasons. The underlying technology behind the Vita's memory cards really isn't any different than other memory card types on the market. But it is a unique form factor, and I think Sony priced those cards very high as a way to combat piracy. I think they figured that if the cost of a memory card was high enough, only the really die-hard people would pay that kind of money to pirate the games. Or in the very least, if a lot of people did decide to pirate games and buy those memory cards, Sony would make up some extra money from the really high margins they got off of the price of those cards. Unfortunately, that ended up being a big deterrent to potential PS Vita buyers. Yes, typical Vita games that you would buy at retail came on separate little memory cards. Very small, very compact, very portable. I like those little card format. It's a very good way to do it. But not that many games came out at retail on physical cards. Sony relied pretty heavily on the PlayStation Store to distribute games for that platform, especially after they really let the independent developers start writing software for that console as well. And in fact, I would say the indie game scene is one of the brightest things on the Vita. There's a lot of really good games for the Vita that you can get only as downloads from the PlayStation Store. But of course, that requires a memory card to store those games on. And if you've got to pay out the nose for a memory card, last time I checked, a 32 gig memory card was upwards of $80 US, which is ridiculous considering that a 32 gig micro SD card is less than $10. Well, it kind of makes sense that people would get put off by that. If the majority of fun games were locked away behind this really expensive paywall, that being the memory card, even if the game prices themselves were low, why would you want to invest in a console like that? Add to that the fact that Sony never really marketed the Vita much, or at least very well. The console did get some really cool features, like remote play for the PS4. It was the first thing to get remote play off the PS4, even before Sony opened it up for remote play on PCs and Macs. But that really wasn't enough, I think, to get people to move to the platform. So where do we go from here? If you've already got a Vita, don't worry, because it seems like Sony is still supporting it pretty well. In fact, you get new games every month as part of PS Plus for that console. There's still tons of games on the PlayStation Store. And if history repeats itself, which I suspect it will, Sony will offer those games on the PlayStation Store for a number of years to come, at least judging by the length of time it went between them discontinuing the PSP hardware and then stopping support for the PSP online. So the Vita is still going to be a viable console to find new games for and continue to play for a number of years to come. If you're interested in getting into the Vita, and this is a point of contention that I don't quite understand, it seems like it's really black and white amongst gaming fans as to whether the Vita is a good thing or a bad thing. It doesn't seem like there's this pocket of Vita fans and then everyone else is just kind of ambivalent towards it. At least based on the comments off of my previous video, it seems like half of the people love the Vita and the other half absolutely hate it. I don't know why they hate it. And of the people who hate it, they often said, don't get into it. It's dead. Why spend your money on it? I don't understand that argument of just because it's no longer supported or actively being sold by the manufacturer that you shouldn't get into a console. If you're going to take that logic and apply it to the rest of video gaming, then by definition, you wouldn't get into any console other than the current one, right? So it'd be the same argument as saying like, well, should I get into the Super NES? No, Nintendo doesn't support it anymore. That's BS. You can get into whatever video game console you want. So if you're interested in getting into the Vita, I say go for it, just like I would say go for it if you asked me if you should get into any other gaming console. You can still find Vita hardware, both new and used. Used prices, at least in the US, that I last checked, tend to range between $100 and $150 based on the model And the color, the black original PS Vitas tend to be about $100. The less common white original ones tend to be towards $150. Some third-party sellers still have new slim Vitas in stock. Those tend to go for about $200. The ace in the hole, if you're really desperate to find Vita hardware and you can't find a good deal anywhere else, you don't want to buy a used one, is that they're still being actively sold in Japan. And one thing that I absolutely love about the Vita is that there is no region locking on it whatsoever. Not in terms of the games, not in terms of the region or language options on the console itself, and not even when it comes to your PSN account or PlayStation Plus. Case in point, I have two PS Vitas. I've got an original one from the US, but I've got one of the slim models from Japan. Both of them behave exactly the same. I was able to take my Japanese Vita and set it to English as the UI. I'm able to play games that I bought in the US on that console. And what's more, I was able to hook it up to my PSN account and download games off of PlayStation Plus, no problem. It didn't complain. It didn't act any different. So that's a really nice thing, is you've got an even wider library of hardware options and games available to you if you're willing to look beyond your own region. Obviously, there's tons of JRPGs available for that console, but I'd say there's a decent selection of different genres as well. There's a few really good racing games, some platformers, lots of indie titles, as I said. Race the Sun is a really fun one. And just go explore on the PlayStation Store. Again, the only real pain point behind this console, and I think the hardware itself is priced pretty reasonably, are those memory cards. You're going to have to do a lot of digging to find a good deal on one, or just accept the fact that they're costly and, you're going to have to pay the price. But in any event, sad to say, it really looks like the Vita is done in North America. A lot of retailers no longer carry it. Even the game supply is starting to dwindle. Really, for new games, you need to look online only. But if you're willing to deal with buying one used, there's lots of options out there for you. As for original PS Vita versus the slim model, pros and cons there. The original one arguably has a better screen, but in practice I haven't really noticed much of a difference. What I can tell you is that the original one is a little bit thicker, and I find it a bit more comfortable to hold. The upside to the slim model is that it has a standard micro USB port on it for data transfer and charging. You don't need the proprietary cable that the original model needed. So I tend to gravitate towards the slim one just because it's more convenient for me to deal with. I don't need to have a whole bunch of cables laying around in order to charge it or transfer data to and from it. But either console is great. They both act the same. They both offer the same performance, and performance on the Vita is really good for a handheld. Very smooth video, nice high-resolution screen. It's a great gaming experience. So if you were to ask me, should I get into the Vita, I would say if it interests you, go for it. Just remember, you may need to pay a little bit more than you might be willing for that memory card. So I'm curious as to your thoughts. Do you own a Vita? Do you like it? Are you one of those people who for some reason hates the Vita? If you hate the Vita, can you at least explain why? What do you think is the future for handheld gaming in general? It seems like Sony's getting out of that market and Nintendo is trying to consolidate it with the Switch. Are the days for dedicated mobile gaming hardware numbered, or are we just looking at kind of a new chapter in its history? So be sure to leave all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, I'm always soliciting feedback and suggestions for future podcast topics, so be sure to hit me up down in the comments for those as well. If you like the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.